It was an overcast morning in August 1913 when a 43-year-old man named Joe Knowles shook hands with some well-wishers and headed off alone into the woods. He wore only a jockstrap, which he discarded once modesty permitted, and carried nothing at all in the way of supplies, clothing, or equipment. Knowles had vowed to spend 60 days in the woods for an experiment that would see him try to live without any of the trappings of modern civilization. A headline in the Boston Sunday Post, where Knowles had formerly worked as an illustrator, screamed, "Naked as caveman, he enters woods." Knowles' spell in the woods started near the hamlet of Eustis in Maine, more than 200 miles north of Boston, where the would-be woodsman lived. He arrived sporting a brown suit before changing into his jockstrap. 2 doctors checked that he had no survival aids secreted in his person. Then, after a last cigarette, Knowles set off shouting to the assembled friends and journalists, "See you later, boys." In fact, the Boston Post and its Sunday sister paper had the exclusive rights to the story. Moreover, Knowles was going to pen contributions, including sketches for the newspaper. Obviously, his self-imposed rules meant that he had no ink or paper, so he'd be producing his reports using homemade charcoal pencils and parchment made from birch bark. The reports would then be left at a prearranged pickup spot to be collected by a Post employee. The whole Knowles saga was played out against a backdrop of intense competition in Boston between newspapers that were hungry for circulation. In 1913, there were no less than 10 daily papers slugging it out for the attention of the city's good citizens. Many of them were based in Boston's Washington Street, which was known as Newspaper Row. And the Boston Post clearly thought it was onto a winner with the story of Knowles' plucky battle against nature. It was said that Knowles, once an illustrator for the Post, came up with the idea for his forest survival stunt while sat in a bar on Newspaper Row with his drinking buddy Michael McCoe, a freelance journalist who will appear again later in the story. In his book Alone in the Wilderness, Knowles later claimed a more romantic inspiration, writing that the idea came to him while painting in Vermont. It's been said that Knowles first approached the Boston American, owned by renowned newspaperman William Randolph Hearst, who had a reputation for covering flamboyant stunts. For some reason, though, Hearst turned him down, so the Post got the scoop instead. And it proved to be a shrewd move for the Post. While Knowles was in the woods, its sales more than doubled. Knowles reported back to the Post in great detail. On day 2 in the woods, he'd made a basket, foraged for berries, and caught 2 trout with a homemade spear, although both were unfortunately pilfered by a mink. Getting a fire going had proved impossible in the damp woods, but he fashioned a rough shelter from branches and moss. This fairly mundane chronicle of Knowles' struggle in the woods continued for a few days, then abruptly stopped for more than a week. The Post used this interruption in Knowles' reports to build up tension, suggesting that he might be lying injured and helpless. But sure enough, Knowles eventually resumed communications, and the Post announced this momentous occasion with the headline, "Knowles catches bear in pit and kills it with club." Since this part of the year was off-season for bear hunting, the Post's follow-up story was headlined, "The wardens are mustering the courage to tackle the forest man in his lair and drag him out." Knowles' next feat, breathlessly reported by the Post, was to go trekking, making his way across the difficult terrain of the Maine woods and eventually arriving outside the Quebecois village of Megantic. The headline this time was, "Knowles, clad in skins, comes out of the forest. Tanned like an Indian, almost black from exposure to the sun, scratched and bruised from head to foot by briars and underbrush, upper garment sleeveless. Had no underwear," the Post continued. It seems that the first person who Knowles stumbled across was a young girl. You might think that she would have fled at the sight of this disheveled man lurching out of the woods, but not a bit of it by all accounts. One of the Post writers subsequently described the encounter. He smiled and the girl saw the gold in his teeth flash. "He's a real man," she said to herself. And Knowles' story now went nationwide. Indeed, you could say that he had become the first reality show celebrity, half a century before there was a television in every home. Knowles then made his way back to Boston by train to be greeted by a 200,000-strong crowd of rapturous admirers. Almost inevitably, doubts about the authenticity of Knowles' wild man sojourn in the woods began to surface almost as soon as he'd returned to civilization. But regardless, Knowles went right ahead and exploited his newfound fame to the full. His book, Alone in the Wilderness, sold 30,000 copies, and he starred in a Hollywood movie of the same name in 1914. Predictably enough, it was to be a Boston Post rival, the Boston American, the very paper that had turned down Knowles' survivalist proposal, that stuck the knife in. The American claimed that Knowles had actually been living in a perfectly good log cabin for most of his 60 days in the woods. Furthermore, the American alleged Knowles had dined well on canned food washed down with beer. And more than 2 decades later, further evidence emerged to support these accusations. It was contained in an article by journalist Richard O. Boyer in The New Yorker, written to mark the 25th anniversary of Knowles' time in the woods. Much of Boyer's article was based on an interview with Michael McCoe, Knowles' old pal who we met earlier. As we've already heard, McCoe had supposedly helped his friend to come up with the whole idea of living rough in the woods. And now McCoe claimed that it was actually him, not Knowles, who'd written the missives from the wilderness. McCoe alleged that he and Knowles had agreed that McCoe would stay in a cabin a couple miles from where Knowles entered the woods. Knowles would live in the forest, but McCoe would be available to polish up Knowles' accounts of his time living as a primitive. McCoe claimed that Knowles had instead showed up almost right away and actually lived at the cabin for most of the 60 days. McCoe made plenty of other damning allegations. He said that a trapper found the pair and consequently had to be paid off. The bear skin that was supposedly from an animal that Knowles had killed was in fact purchased for $12, he claimed. And McCoe also supposedly paid for the services of an Indian guide to take Knowles to the spot where he eventually emerged from the woods. Whatever the truth was, after his time in the limelight, Knowles returned to obscurity. He spent his later years living in a shack overlooking the Columbia River in Seaview, Washington. And those that knew him during that period, prior to his death in 1942, say that he never did acknowledge, even after a drink or two, that the details of his exploits might have been embroidered, to say the least.